boom-bust cycle a little bit, review that a little bit, and then we're going to look at 3 common myths or oversimplifications about the Great Depression that are very common to hear in history, but this shows the need for economic historians, why you need people who are trained and understand and read in both disciplines, because if you have just one or the other, you miss key information and they're mutually reinforcing. And truthfully, a lot of historians give their opinions on economic aspects of what's going on, but they don't know any economics. They don't have any reading or training really in economics. They misdiagnose, they oversimplify, and this is why it's actually not easy. Let's be fair to them. It's not easy to be a historian if you want to do it well. If you'd have to have an expertise and a knowledge in a number of things in order to give a well-rounded picture of what's going on historically. On the other side, if you're just an economist, you can be a good economist, but if you try to speak to history, you can end up with kind of a cartoonish view of history, just trying to explain economic models and lay it over the top of something that is more complicated. So anyway, but let's look at first the boom-bust cycle and talk about what causes this. And remember that this goes back to week 1 or 2 of this class, where we were talking about what economics is and how it works. And if you can understand that, then you can understand recessions and depressions, which are this part of the business cycle, and you can understand the business cycle as a whole. Okay, because if you understand how those basic principles work, they still apply when you get to more complicated areas. Okay, that's what's kind of nice about economics, is it rests on some fundamentally simple concepts and principles. It's just that often people, even people who get degrees in economics, they just become so focused and so myopic and specialized that they focus on one little area that they forget. So in my opinion, they forget a lot of the basic starting first principles of economics, and then they leave those behind in order to focus on one particular area. But anyway, so remember, economics is the study of human action operating with scarce resources that have alternative uses. So remember, it's human decision making. It's not just, like looking at physical or chemical properties that, like, if you pour this chemical into this chemical, it will have this chemical reaction or physical reaction, or whatever the case may be. It's not that type of science. It's a social science that looks at humans, and the thing that we're studying, which we are, human beings, make decisions. So that makes the study harder, because now they have decision-making processes, but it also makes it, we can intuit because we share that same human nature. We just have to make sure that we do so accurately, and we start with the first principle of human action in economics, that it's a self-evident truth, meaning that humans act, they make decisions, they do things. And even if they choose not to do things, that inaction is a type of action. And they do so because of reasons known to them. They do so rationally. They make decisions trying to get to goals, okay? Now, they do that in a world of scarce resources. There are limits. There's time and space, and we have finite resources that we can't satisfy all of our wants and needs. Therefore, we have to consolidate, we have to prioritize, we have to rank, we have to choose between things. We live in a world of trade-offs, and we have to organize our demand along a limited supply. and those resources could be used to do something else. So the supply, the scarce resources, that's the supply, what's available, works with the demand, who wants it and for what, okay? So that ends up creating, as we talked about a little bit more on as we advance this, it creates a network of signals called prices. Remember that prices indicate if they're working correctly, meaning they haven't been artificially manipulated in some way. If prices are allowed to be flexible and fluctuate, they indicate information about supply and demand. Prices tell us about the goods and services available to us in an economy, and they help us make decisions. So, for example, a higher price tells us one or a couple of things. A higher price under normal circumstances indicates to us that there is less of something available. Now, there are a couple of reasons why there might be less of it available. There might be less of it available because there's literally less of it available in the supply of a scarce resource, or there might be less of it available because more people happen to want the same thing at the same time, or both. Following that, so that causes a higher price. So a higher price signals to us, use less of this, buy less of this, or that if you buy less of this, you're going to buy the same amount or more of this, you're going to have to give up somewhere else because it costs more now. Okay, so that's what prices tell us. They help us make decisions and respond to real-time conditions of supply and demand. Not perfectly, but it helps us organize across time and space and with other people. And a lower price tells us the exact opposite. A lower price tells us that there is more available, either because there's literally more of the scarce resource, it's abundant at that time, so there's more supply, or less people want it at the same time. That's demand. And therefore, or both, and for that reason, the price has dropped. And how do most people respond when a price of something that they usually want goes down? They usually buy more of it, or they buy the same amount, but they can reorganize their decisions and their trade-offs because this is now more plentiful, okay? But what happens when you start to mess with prices artificially? What happens when prices stop communicating accurate information about reality? What if prices are not allowed to be flexible according to real-time market conditions? Okay. Now remember what happened with that article we read about prices and water, that if the price of water is held artificially low and people see that low price and they keep buying and doing the same amount that they were doing with water, their demand remains the same, then you can run into shortages. On the other side, if you keep a price artificially high, people tend to buy less of it, and you can end up with oversupply or waste. Now, why are we going back to day one? Well, now we can apply it to recessions and depressions. Okay, about a little over 100 years ago, 1913, the United States government created and chartered this central bank called the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has been given, along with the government, has been given this unique monopolistic power to control the money supply of the United States. Now it's chartered, now it's neither technically private nor technically public. It's a quasi-public private entity. It's a bank of banks called a central bank that all other banks of the United States must be subservient to, and it declares all other banks how much they must hold in reserves. Okay. Now this bank, this central bank, created in 1913, right before World War I, has this unique power to be able to change and adjust the money supply of the United States. It can declare more money into the economy, adding to the money supply without adding goods and services to the economy. That's called inflation. Remember, rising prices are not inflation. It's the artificial increase in the money supply without adding goods and services. Okay. On the other hand, it can deflate. It can take money out of the economy. Okay. We've talked about inflation before. We've talked about the consequences of inflation, what it does to purchasing power, how it depletes the value of money, how it encourages debt. And it's worth mentioning that some 96 cents of every dollar has been depleted out of the US dollar since 1913. In particular, if you look at an inflation chart, that means that inflation has gone up by about 2,500%. So that what $100 would have bought you in 1913, it would now take about $2,600 to buy you in 2021. And so it also encourages debt. So after the creation of this entity, you see skyrocketing debts of not just government, not just national debt, but you also see skyrocketing debt, personal debt of individuals. Because if the value of the money in the future is going to be less valuable, it encourages people to take out loans when the money is more valuable in the present and then pay back with dollars that are less valuable in the future. And thereby debt is encouraged by this inflationary adding to the money supply. In addition to that, now it comes back to the price theory that we were just talking about. Adding to the money supply manipulates the interest rate. Now, what is the interest rate? The interest rate is nothing more or less than the price to borrow money. The interest rate is nothing more or less than the price to borrow money. And we just talked about how prices work. Now, an interest rate works like this. If there is more money, like in banks and stuff available from which banks and other loan-making institutions can make loans, then there tends to be a lower price to borrow money because there's more money available at that time. So the interest rate tends to be lower. On the other side, if there's less money available in savings, then the interest rate tends to be higher. This is just kind of a natural or organic interest rate that's a flexible price that just changes according to whatever's going on in the economy at the time, what decisions people are making. So money that's in the bank is actually doing stuff. I know it looks like it's just sitting there, and for all intents and purposes, it is. You can access it, but the bank is also you actually make a little bit of money for your money just being in the bank, because by putting it in there, you've agreed with the bank that the bank can use your money as collateral to kind of loan out to other people who are growing businesses and doing all that type of stuff. So by your money being in the bank, you're actually helping grow the economy in a sense. That's why you make a little bit of interest. You used to make a lot more for your money just being in the bank by interest, but so you make positive interest of your money being in the bank. Now you don't make that much. Okay. Now, if a lot of people decide I'm not going to consume now in the present, for whatever reason, I'm going to put my money away and save. And let's say a lot of people do that at the same time. That grows the pool of money. That grows the existing amount of savings available in an economy. And therefore, the interest rate, the amount to borrow money, drops. And that tells businesses, this might be a good time. People have a lot of savings and stuff available, and the price to borrow money is low. This might be a good time to invest and grow our businesses and provide more goods and services. On the other hand, if people are consuming a lot more and they don't have as much in savings, and the big supply of money and savings shrinks, then the interest rate, the amount to borrow money, increases. It's more costly to borrow money because there's less of it. Same principle applies with anything, applies with donuts. If there's a supply of one donut and 10 people want it, the price will be higher. But if you add to the supply, if there's 100 donuts and 10 people want it, well, then the price of donuts will probably come down. Same thing with the interest rate regarding the amount to borrow money, the price to borrow money. So that's all well and good, and that can cause, some businesses and individuals can make bad decisions, and they do. The businesses can still grow and overexpand, and people can still get into debt. Businesses can still get into debt and overextend themselves and go either through personal financial hardship, or a business would go out of business, and all that's the case. But that affects a few businesses and individuals at one time, not all at once. It's just a few people here and there, and businesses here and there. And then those businesses get liquidated, they get sold off. Somebody else either fills that void in the market, or that business is not continued. And so that's all normal. But what if there's an artificial manipulation of the interest rate? Well, here's the thing. If you add to the money supply, whether an individual, bank, or government, when you pump a bunch of money into the economy, what that looks like is that there's all this saving and extra money now. But there's not really more wealth in the economy. You can't just print wealth into existence or growth into existence. And so just by printing, though, it looks like there's all this saving happening. And so the interest rate goes down. Now, what happens when prices go down? When prices go down, demand tends to go up, meaning people buy more of that thing. So when the price to borrow money, the interest rate, goes down, businesses and individuals start to borrow and borrow and borrow more money, and they start to try to grow their businesses. They start adding, they start hiring, they start buying more technologies, they start investing in capital and to make their products, and machinery to make their products, and computers and office spaces, and they may go into new regions, and they may enter new markets, and they may go international, and they may pay for all this stuff to try to expand their reach and get more customers to see and interact with their goods and services. So for a while, there's all this expanse and growth of business, and it seems like it's all going well, and everybody's like, wow, we're having all these, businesses expand, the prices are low, we're having a good time, like everybody's growing, people are thinking that this is always going to go up, but it's all based on misinformation. It's based on savings that weren't there. It's building all this with the assumption that there's going to be the requisite demand for all of this in the economy. But after building all of this stuff, this is often called the skyscraper curse in economics, because a lot of times you see with this investment, you see the growth and building of skyscrapers and buildings and offices and all this stuff. And then they become incomplete when it hits this phase. It hits this peak of this boom, and then it goes into a recession. When they realize there is not the market demand for what they were creating, businesses go, and now businesses plus individuals are under tremendous amounts of debt. They now go into this decline, and they can't justify all the spending that they just created. So now, and we could, hold them responsible to some extent, that you could say, yes, they shouldn't have borrowed that much and gone into debt, and all that is true, but they were operating under bad information of the low interest rate that was artificial. And so now they start to go into a recession. That's the decline here. And that recession can go into a bust, which is the depression phase. Okay, so now businesses can't justify the spending that they just did. There's not the market demand, so therefore they sometimes have to shrink their business. They have to scale back. That means layoffs and unemployment. Some businesses go out of business, so that means less goods and services available from that particular business. It also means the people working for that business are unemployed. And also, this isn't just happening to one business. This is all these businesses made these decisions, and this happens to all of them at the same time. Now, if those businesses had investors, all the investors pull out their money. The businesses have to liquidate, sell off all the aspects of their business in order to pay back the investors. And then those businesses have to come down on the stock market. There can be people start feeling uncertain and unstable. And so they start pulling money out of the stock market. And then as it comes down, people pull out even more money out of the stock market, often taking their money out of the loss, at a loss, losing money in the process, and the stock market drops as well. So, I mean, there can be all kinds of things going on as unemployment spreads throughout the economy and all this type of stuff. Now, these features, they existed before 1913, right? They existed at other times, usually from government/banking policies, where government and banks worked together to create this type of issue. Same principles, just different entities. Now, they were usually any type of market correction like this, which the recession/depression is a market correction, was usually quick. For example, the Depression of 1920 was over by 1921. The Depression of 1837, Panic of 1837, which I'm sure you've never heard of, was over in 6 months. Right? There was a Panic of 1819, right? Caused by the inflationary printing and spending of the War of 1812, where banks were legally allowed to do something that otherwise would be illegal and start printing up a bunch of money, more than they had reserves in gold and silver in order to pay for the war. And that created a boom-bust cycle. Okay? The Great Depression is so great because it's the longest. It lasted really arguably until the end of World War II. And that's what we're going to talk about real quick here, why you need not just history, not just economics, but economic history, is you need to understand both to really grasp what was going on. So I'll talk about here 3 common myths of the Great Depression. Myth number 1 is that Herbert Hoover did not want to use the government to prevent the Depression, which is really odd because Herbert Hoover actually was an economic interventionist. He was the one that set the tone and the precedent for intervening in the economy. So it's kind of odd that he's gone down in history as the kind of hands-off president who didn't want to do anything, when in fact, this is a historical error as well as an economic error, that Herbert Hoover was so involved in creating these programs, employment programs, these business/government/union programs, all these things. I was just listening to a book about Herbert Hoover's involvement and response to the Depression yesterday on an audiobook. And it was talking about all these programs he worked to create. And he really laid the foundation for what would be the groundwork for the later New Deal that Roosevelt would just take and expand. Now, the myth about Hoover's said, okay, he's the president who didn't do anything, and everybody kind of loves FDR. It's historically inaccurate. Hoover laid the groundwork for the New Deal. FDR just expanded and continued it. Myth number two, which I think is more of an oversimplification than a myth, but it has this shows also just the, and I don't mean this term in a derogatory way, but the ignorance of historians with regard to economics, is that FDR's New Deal saved America from the Great Depression. When in actuality, the economy did not return to pre-Depression levels. The New Deal, as measured by return to employment, return of private investment, return of economic growth and GDP or anything like that, those type of measures stayed low or even worsened through the Great Depression. The New Deal programs did not turn around the Great Depression and did not move those economic factors in a positive direction. And there's even some argument there. Some say, well, that the 1920s were such a disaster that even the New Deal couldn't turn it around. But there's also argument, counter argument to that would say, well, actually the New Deal programs were actually counterproductive to the ending of the Depression. There are some economists who look at the situation at that time and say all the factors were there for a return to normalcy by 1935. But the Great Depression lasts all the way through the 1930s and arguably until or even through World War II, until 1946. And then the third myth, and this is one that well-meaning historians say all the time, is that World War II brought America out of the Great Depression. And I understand why they say that, because there is the Depression, there's World War II, and then after World War II, there's 1946, which is a boom in prosperity. However, that's an oversimplification, and it just shows, again, that historians often just don't understand their economics, because the assumption there is that stimulus generated by wartime spending in a war economy gave a jump start that got the economy going again. But it's built on this presupposition that spending generates wealth and growth. Well, it kind of does in a halfway, in some limited aspects of the economy. But a war economy of World War II, where the government basically takes over aspects of the economy, yeah, unemployment went down for sure during World War II, but that's because you took all these men and sent them overseas to fight in a war. So you can't really measure a war economy the same way as you would an economy under normal circumstances, not under the command style of a wartime economy. So the assumption is that, oh, yeah, if you just generate a bunch of spending, that will happen. Well, remember, women had joined the workforce, all this stuff was going on, and then their men were going to return, and after World War II, and all these programs were going to be scaled back. A lot of people thought, well, wait a second, the economy is not going to be able to sustain this. There's going to be all this unemployment because there's going to be men and women working in many cases. There's also, the economy is used to now all this government spending from the war and generating all this for the war effort. You just can't go back to normal. Private investment won't go back up. And what actually happened was men came back. They scaled back all these wartime programs in the United States. The kind of war economy, the command economy was rolled back. Private investment returned. Employment returned. Economic growth returned. And there was a boom of growth during that time. So it was actually the rolling back of the war state that generated that growth and brought an end to the Depression in 1946. So it's the Great Depression because it really lasts from, I guess, 1929-ish to arguably 1946. But World War II spending did not end the Great Depression. It was the rolling back of the war economy to a normal state in 1946 that arguably brought back the economic growth and employment.